Welcome back to a little bit of philosophy. This is Philosophy 101, Unit 3, Lecture 5, Part 1, William Paley and the Teleological Argument. So far in our brief exploration of the philosophy of religion, we've been focusing on arguments for God's existence. Often called natural religion as opposed to revealed religion, its purpose was to provide rational justification for religious belief. Now, while the ancient Greek and Hellenistic philosophers gave some arguments for God's existence, it was not a primary focus of philosophical activity until St. Anselm wrote his groundbreaking Proslogion in 1078, in which he argued that the very idea of God, if properly understood, provided a priori evidence of the existence of God. In other words, logic alone, he believed, was sufficient to demonstrate that God exists, and indeed what properties would be necessary for any being worthy of the moniker God. With the reintroduction of Aristotle's philosophy, 100 years later, St. Thomas would attempt an a posteriori approach to the subject in his 5 Proofs of God's Existence from Book 1 of the Summa Theologica. Thomas's empirical approach to the question of God's existence and nature is reflective of the profound influence of Aristotle. Whether it's motion or causation or perhaps even the universe itself, the Aristotelian point of view held that it was rational to ask, why do these phenomena exist? And in St. Thomas's last proof, he focused on the order and regularity that we find in the natural world. If things work together in nature, there must be a reason, and Thomas concludes that that reason is God. This is the type of argument we're going to be focusing on in more detail in this video, but we'll be looking at the most famous version given in William Paley's book, Natural Theology, or Evidence of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity Collected from the Appearances of Nature, published in 1802. Like Thomas's cosmological arguments, Paley's work is a posteriori, so in a sense, we might even call it scientific. Of all the arguments for God's existence, those we categorize as teleological are the most common. In fact, the oldest surviving argument for God's existence in the Western philosophical tradition is found in a fragment from the Hellenistic philosopher Cleanthes of Assos, who led the Stoic school in Athens after the death of its founder, Zeno of Citium. And if you encounter an argument for God's existence today, chances are it will be some version of a teleological argument. William Paley's version of the teleological argument is probably so famous precisely because of its simplicity and clarity. Paley asks us to imagine walking through an uncultivated landscape, a heath to the British, where we might stub our toe against a rock and, in our agitation, ask why the rock was there. Of course, a moment's reflection makes it clear that no one probably put the rock there. We're in nature, and for all we know, the rock might have been there since the beginning of time. But now, Paley asks us to imagine a second scenario. Suppose while we're on a stroll through nature, we encountered a watch on the ground instead of a rock. Setting aside our lack of agitation at stubbing our toe as we did with the rock, the question which comes to our mind seems entirely appropriate. But why? Why is the question silly in the first case, but not in the second? Why is the second case so different from the first case? The answer lies in the phenomenon that we encounter. In the case of the rock, there are properties wholly lacking from the phenomenon of the watch. And what are those differences? The answer is telos, the Greek word for order, end, or purpose, and of course the reason we refer to arguments like this as teleological. Paley says, when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. For example, they're so formed and adjusted so as to produce motion, and that motion is regulated to point out the hour of the day. End quote. Upon closer inspection, we discover even more evidence that the watch and its parts are formed and put together in a particular way, so that if they had been of different sizes or shapes, or if they'd been put together in some order, the object would not be able to do what it does. And of course, the same would be true if we found something else far more simple, like a key, or a shoe, or perhaps even a teddy bear. What we observe in the phenomenon is an ordering of parts to serve a function, an adaptation of means to ends. In short, what we are observing is an artifact. This mechanism being observed, he goes on to say, the inference is inevitable that the watch must have had a maker. Now, we can put the argument into standard form and see it more clearly. Premise 1 tells us that it is rational to infer the existence of a designer if we encounter design. That's because design, or purpose, requires an intentional agent. So an observable phenomenon, such as a watch, demonstrates design, and thus, if we encounter such a phenomenon, we can rationally infer the existence of someone who designed and made it. But suppose someone were to object that you'd never seen a watch being made, and therefore you have no idea how it was made. Well, this wouldn't stop us from concluding that it was made, even if we didn't understand the fabrication process. Or suppose someone, having observed the watch, noticed that it didn't keep very good time, or perhaps didn't even work at all. Even if that were true, it wouldn't detract from the clear inference that someone made it. It's still clearly an artifact, and not a natural phenomenon. Or further, suppose someone were to object to our conclusion because it wasn't clear how all the parts actually worked together to create the observable phenomenon, or even if there were some of the parts that didn't seem to do anything at all. Once again, our ignorance of what each part is for does not detract from our conclusion that there was an intentional agent behind the phenomenon. Or suppose someone asserted that the reason the parts are in their present order is just one of an infinite number of possible random combinations of ordering. Well, we might grant them that it is certainly mathematically true that there are many other possible ways that the parts could be put together, but what we observe is this particular configuration which gives rise to the artifact as we observe it. If we were to disassemble the watch and put the parts in a box and shook them, it might be theoretically true that eventually they would fall together in the right combination to form the watch, but it is exceedingly unlikely that it would ever actually turn out to be the case. Or suppose someone were to claim that there's some Platonic form of watchness that causes these parts to come together in the form that we observe, or that it's the ordering of the parts in the phenomena itself that is causing the idea of order in us. Or maybe that it's just natural law, or maybe we just don't get the big picture, whatever that turns out to be. None of these objections would be sufficient to dislodge us from our firm belief that the artifact we found was indeed an artifact, that is, the byproduct of some intentional agent. Next comes the most important turn in the argument. Paley says, "For every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which exists in the watch also exists in the works of nature. Therefore, nature must have an intelligent designer, even greater than any human intelligence." To see this more clearly, let's put this into standard form with the rest of the argument. The universe is like a watch, or any artifact for that matter, because when we observe it, we observe design. Putting this premise together with premise 1 above, we can then conclude that there must be a universe designer who is responsible for the design that we observe. Premise 4 tells us that we can use the word God to refer to the intelligence behind the ordered universe, and therefore, God, the universe maker, must exist. Undoubtedly, it is the simplicity of the analogy that makes this argument so compelling. The more we look around us in nature, we observe the adaptation of means to ends. This is particularly true when we examine zoological and botanical phenomena, things that Paley was keenly interested in and aware of. But it might just as well apply to geology, and indeed to the cosmos as a whole. Everywhere we look, it seems, we find machines within machines within machines, to a degree which astonishes our imagination. Now, of course, context is always important when considering the history of ideas in general, and philosophy in particular, so it's worth noting how Paley fits into our timeline of Western philosophy. The genesis of what we might call the modern scientific view lies with the questioning of geocentrism in the Renaissance by Nicolas Copernicus, and confirmed 200 years later by Galileo. The epistemological work of John Locke would establish empiricism as the method of scientific inquiry, and provided the theoretical framework for the work of Isaac Newton, his younger contemporary. And Paley also fits into this new empirically minded worldview, and is merely attempting to apply these methods to the subject of natural religion. But even though the shift toward empiricism was firmly underway by the early 19th century when he published Natural Theology, there was still the lingering Aristotelian notion that everything existed for a purpose, or everything that existed has a purpose. This teleological assumption was one of the last entrenched ideas from the medieval worldview to fade from the Western intellectual mind. It would be Darwin's hypothesis of natural selection as the mechanism for biological mutation, as opposed to teleology, that would drive the last nail in the coffin in the latter half of the 19th century. So there's a real sense in which we can forgive Paley seeing design throughout the natural world. It was not uncommon for people to look at the universe in that way at that time. There is, however, another sense in which Paley's teleological worldview is less naive, and that's because he failed to do his philosophical research. As we'll see in our next video, Paley's argument, indeed the whole project of natural religion, had already been dismantled by a work of David Hume, published just a generation earlier. But Paley seems not to have been aware of Hume's work. We've seen that teleological arguments are rooted in empirical observations and are therefore a posteriori in nature. Part of what we observe in the world is a difference between naturally occurring phenomena and those that require some form of intentional agency. All teleological arguments are also analogical in some fundamental sense, as the conclusion is derived from comparing the similarities between artifacts of intelligent design and the universe more broadly construed. It's also important to note that as an inductive form of argument, the conclusions are never going to be certain in the way that, say, the conclusion of the ontological argument would follow from its premises, because the ontological argument is deductive in nature. And part of the nature of deductive arguments is that the conclusions follow necessarily if the premises are true. With induction, on the other hand, we have conclusions that follow with a degree of probability. So we're already seeing in the teleological argument something that is a little bit weaker than a strong deductive conclusion, as we've looked at in some earlier arguments for God's existence. Also, in particular, Paley's version of the teleological argument rests on the famous Watchmaker analogy. So the strength of the conclusion that he draws is going to rest on the strength of the analogy between a watch and the universe. Now, of course, this is not exclusive to Paley, as the universe was increasingly being described throughout the modern period in mechanical terms. This is due in large part to the influence of earlier modern thinkers like René Descartes or Thomas Hobbes, and certainly because of the work of Sir Isaac Newton. Be sure to join us for the second half of this lecture in our next video, when we'll examine David Hume's objections to teleological arguments as we continue to explore a little bit of philosophy.